Saladin, Ahmed. Welcome to One Detroit. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
This has been a very exciting time for your work. I mean, obviously, a lot of comic fans know you as now the longtime writer of Miles Morales, but now this year you branched out to 2 other Spider-Man series, and you are one of the writers on DC Audio's Batman Unburied, and you just launched Copper Bottle, your subscription service for indie comics, and that's not even all of it. It has certainly been a year for you. I mean, how's it been?
Busy, yeah. It's sometimes I sit there and look at the number of different projects I'm working on at once, and I'm sort of astonished and disgusted maybe with myself, but somehow I'm managing to keep it all juggling. Anybody working in creative economy, it's a kind of mix of having to and wanting to. We have these brains that carry us in different directions and get excited by different things at different times, and I think you have to follow that to a degree to maintain your passion. But it's also an economic reality that it's tough making a living in the creative world, even for those of us who've got a bit of a name. And so you have a lot of pots stirring at once in order to make it work.
And in particular, how do you balance one foot in like the big studio, like the Marvel DC world, and then one foot in the indie world with Copper Bottle and your other projects?
It is a balancing act. It's not always a successful one. It was familiar characters and familiar worlds that kind of made me a reader. It was coming back again and again to Spider-Man or to Batman or to Star Wars or whatever it was. So I'll always want to be part of crafting those worlds and telling stories in those worlds. And I think those stories have such an impact across the world. I can have an extremely successful indie title and still the likelihood that some kid in the Netherlands or in Pakistan or in wherever in some village is going to have heard of that character is pretty slim, but they're going to know who Spider-Man is, and so to me it's about always telling these new stories featuring characters and worlds that I create, and balancing that with having a hand in shaping these stories and these myths really that shape the world around us, that are kind of the big stories that everybody hears.
And, I mean, of course, you just mentioned how everybody knows Spider-Man. I'd certainly say Spider-Man has got to be just one of the most continuingly beloved and iconic and kind of ubiquitous superheroes in all the different iterations and all the different mediums. And so now between Miles Morales and Amazing Spider-Man and now your new run, the Spine-Tingling Spider-Man, so you're writing 3 different iterations of that character. First of all, can you tell us, Spine-Tingling Spider-Man, brand new, first issue just dropped end of October. Yeah. So what makes this one different?
I've always loved Peter Parker. I've grown a very powerful relationship with Miles Morales, writing him the past few years. But of course, Peter was the Spider-Man I knew growing up. And to me, he's always been at his most inspiring when he's got the toughest odds against him. And I've always felt there was something to be done with that, and then the fact that horror stories, which I also dabble in a lot, are really about the odds being against you, sometimes overwhelmingly, right? And that's where the sense of horror comes from, not being able to do anything about your situation, which is very rare for superheroes, right?
Right.
And so I went to Marvel and basically was like, I really want to do a horror book featuring Peter Parker, and they were very supportive of it. And so I've lucked out extremely by getting the artist Juan Ferreira, who's just astonishing talent. And that's the thing that we always have to talk about when we talk about comics is art, makes the comic. I can have all the ideas in the world, and it's just an idea until somebody draws it. And Juan took the thing to another level of kind of surreal horror. It's a digital comic, and so we're experimenting with the scrolling format, which is becoming more and more popular, of reading comics on your phone or on an iPad or something like that. Yeah. And it's perfect both for a kind of creeping horror and for Spider-Man and his climbing powers. And so, yeah, it's been a kind of formal experiment, a tonal experiment that Marvel's been willing to go along with, and it's been, I think, pretty successful. We've had a pretty great response so far, so I'm pretty happy.
You know, I don't always think of a big company like Marvel as being like super into taking real narrative risks like that. So getting them to sign off on a horror story with a character as iconic as Spider-Man, was that a tough sell, or how did that happen?
That one, not necessarily, but you definitely, when you're working in licensed worlds, you realize that a lot of you have to build up capital, I guess is the way to put it. A lot of your ability to tell the stories you want to tell comes from building trust and telling stories that are more meat and potatoes, that they feel they can trust you to kind of stretch. I had a weird trajectory with Marvel because my first comic with them was Black Bolt, which was a sort of obscure character that they wanted to elevate a little bit, so they brought a writer who was outside of comics. I was known for fiction at the time, and I was brought in to kind of elevate Black Bolt a little bit. I wrote a very surreal space prison story that was kind of an anti-incarceration story, mostly because I didn't understand how much I was sort of breaking the rules, and I lucked out again with an artist and a guy named Christian Ward, and we won the Eisner Award, the biggest award in comics for that comic, my first comic I wrote, and I think it was because I didn't think too much about those rules when I first went in. What you realize when you're dealing with an established universe like that is that there are rules, there are expectations, and even within kind of being able to stretch a bit, it's like writing a sonnet, right? A sonnet is 14 lines, and there are certain rules to the meter and the rhyme, and you can do a lot of things within those rules, but if you're going in to completely write something else, then you're not writing a sonnet. And I approach Big Two work like that. I know there are constraints there. I understand what the constraints are, and I sort of plan to work within them while stretching them a little bit.
Like you mentioned there with your Black Bolt run with the anti-incarceration themes, like your work does consistently have a lot of like social justice themes, and like you definitely work a lot of that in there, even in, you know, like the Big Two work.
Yeah, and that's it's super important to me to talk about the world around us, even whether I'm talking about aliens or elves or vampires or it's another planet, it's another dimension. I'm still talking about our world in our time, and I think we have a responsibility to do that as storytellers. I get resentful when people tell me I have a responsibility to it, but I do because I think that artists. We don't like necessarily to be told what to do in that way, but I do think that you know, we're part of a larger world, and dire things are happening in that world right now to a lot of people, and if we don't talk about that stuff as much as we're able to in the arenas that we're able to, I think we're you know, falling down on our duties as human beings. So when I do independent work, that stuff is a lot more on the sleeve, probably, because, again, it's a dance with corporate-controlled universes. You are always going to be bumping up against the status quo, the way things are, and so a status quo is always resistant to change. And so if you're proposing work that centers change and centers the kind of characters that haven't always been centered, and thinks of heroism differently than it's been thought of, and thinks of the police differently than they've been thought of in comic books, or thinks of prison differently than it's been thought of in comic books, you're always going to come up against resistance. So that said, you know, you kind of find allies because institutions are made out of people. You find people who are sympathetic and who are also kind of thinking about this stuff, and you work with them and you try and tell those stories as boldly as you can, without as boldly as you can without giving up the microphone, I guess. And that's always the danger. I could tomorrow write the most radical script you know, that's ever been written for a Spider-Man comic and not have it published and promptly lose the chance to have access to that platform and to shape the way that those stories work in that platform. And so it's always a dance.
In Abbott, the way that, page one of that comic is, Abbott breaking the story of, the police killing of a black teenager, and just like right out of the gate, even though you set the story in the 70s, like reading it today, it really hits home to our world now.
Yeah, Abbott was my first creator-owned comic, and it's the story of a female journalist, a female black journalist in the 1970s working at a white newspaper. And it's a story about race, it's a story about gender, it's a story about newspapers, specifically, and journalism more generally. It's a story, it's about the 70s, but it's also about our own time. But as much as anything, it's a story about Detroit. It's sort of, I knew when I wrote my first sort of independent comic that it was going to be about Detroit. The city, now I'm from Dearborn, right? I'm from a Arab enclave in Dearborn, from an immigrant community there that raised me. But I was always raised with a love for and respect for Detroit, and my father was very immersed in the arts scene in Detroit, and so I grew up going to concerts, street fairs, hanging out, and learning to love the city, the way it sounded, the way it looked, and also I was raised with an awareness that Detroit had been slandered. I was raised to understand that there was a lot of racism at the center of why Detroit had essentially been sabotaged. And my father and a lot of the black activists that he knew, I had that spelled out to me at a very early age, right? And so the kind of predominant narrative in the suburbs, though, was sort of, oh, Detroit's so dangerous and it's fallen apart, it used to be great. And it's a transparently racist sort of take when you strip away just a layer of kind of why people felt that way about Detroit. But I grew up in an era, and things have changed a bit back in the other direction now, but I grew up in an era where that was pretty universally in the suburbs, and especially among white people, the story about Detroit. And I knew it was a lie. And so, to me, one of the most important things writers do is to expose lies and tell the truth. It's why I made a journalist the hero of my story rather than a police officer or a detective. And it's part of why I do what I do. So, on the one hand, Abbott is a fun, scary story, hopefully, about a woman using magic powers to hunt evil wizards and a darkness that is haunting the land. But it's also very much a story about the history of Detroit and about the way in which Detroit in the 70s, even as people were saying it was falling apart or was going to the dogs or whatever, was a place of renaissance, of true cultural renaissance, of emancipation, of people kind of taking hold of power for the first time that had been denied to them for a very long time. The second volume of Abbott is about the election of the first black mayor, who in our world is not named as Coleman Young because it's a slightly different world. But so the character of the mayor is never named per se, but it's about that election to a degree. And these are things that I think shaped the city to this day. They're things that there are still a lot of twisted tales around about. And so when I published Abbott, it was pretty remarkable, the response, because whereas I published Spider-Man comics or a Batman story or whatever it might be, that fandom is intense and big and diverse, and people will come, but they're coming for those characters. And when Abbott came out, the Detroit Free Press ran a story on it, and there was a signing in the comic book store Vault of Midnight in its previous location. And it was astonishing, the people who showed up for that, because it was a lot of older people who had never read comic books, who didn't care about comic books, who saw a published excerpt of a story about Detroit in the 70s, about a black woman telling the truth, and they came out to buy that. And so I had a long line of like grannies and aunties and people that like I'd never had to line up to buy my comics before. And it demonstrated as clearly as possible to me that people are hungry for these stories that tell the truth about things that have been lied about for so long.
And now we're in the new location with Abbott painted on the side of the building.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Mind-blowing. Yeah.
Those experiences of growing up in Dearborn and near Detroit and having like that sense of needing to tell the truth, how does that translate over for you into these other stories that are, set outside Detroit, set in, other real or fictional places?
Well, one of my big tasks when I started working with Marvel that I set for myself a bit sneakily was to establish the Detroit kind of a chapter of the Marvel universe. I don't know if chapter is the right word, but there are very few characters who are not from New York City in Marvel, or they might be from another planet or another dimension, but if they're from Earth, most of them are from New York. And so, and that makes sense. It's where the Marvel Universe's epicenter is. Like, there's a reason that all those stories anchor in Manhattan, but it's a big country, and our own Michigan is part of it, and so I knew that I wanted to create Michigan heroes, Detroit heroes, when I went to Marvel. So the first character that I created with Detroit roots was in Miles Morales' Spider-Man, and her name is Tiana Toombs, aka Starling. And she is she's the granddaughter of the Spider-Man, classic Spider-Man villain, the Vulture. And so her powers are modeled on his. She has a cool suit with big wings, and she can fly. And she's a sort of started as a bit of a foil, but has become a bit of a love interest for Miles. Yeah. And that was in response to a number of things. A number of folks had sort of noted that Miles didn't have black women in his life, and so I wanted to kind of address that a little bit. He needed a little bit of a love interest, so I wanted to address that, but when I started to think about who this character was, Detroit called out to me, and so we got to do some really great scenes about in her origin issue with her practicing her wings, flying above the Detroit River and flying around the Renaissance Center and stuff like that, and that was really fun to be able to add that into the Marvel Universe. And then I did have to represent my own Dearborn, Michigan, and Arab Americans. I am Arab American, and there's haven't been many superheroes, if any. There have been a couple at DC. There were not really any at Marvel, and so I created their Fadi Fadlallah, also known as Amulet, in the pages of Ms. Marvel, and he's a kind of big, beefy, good, thick boy who's a football player with a heart of gold, and he comes to New Jersey, which is where Ms. Marvel's adventures take place, from Dearborn, Michigan, and went to Fortson High School, actually, so which was my alma mater. So I'm shamelessly sort of staking out some Michigan ground in the Marvel universe because I think it only enriches the place.
As you just mentioned, definitely another through line through your work is how diverse your characters are in terms of background, in terms of gender, and I mean like the established characters you've written like Miles and Kamala Khan, and then the characters you've introduced as well. And I know with Copper Bottle, kind of your mission statement with that is, that's creator-owned, independent comics, kind of with really like a focus on a lot of creators of color and women, and it is like so important to have that representation on and off the page and making comics like just a more diverse medium.
Well, I appreciate the distinction between on and off the page because they're definitely separate things. I think that we've made strides, not as many as we could have, but we've made strides as a culture in terms of our movies, our TV shows, our video games, our comics, representing better what our culture looks like, right? So that there are Muslim characters on TV, there are trans characters in video games, there are things that when I was a kid just plain weren't there. And so I'm 46 years old now. I'm old enough to be able to see some of the progress that has earnestly been made. Yeah. But there's still a long way to go. And it is twofold. It's the question of just being able to see yourself. I can remember how desperate I was to latch onto characters that had any bit of Arabness or Muslimness, or no matter how cheesily and slightly stereotypically it might have been rendered, right? Falling in love with a Black Panther because he had a name that almost sounded Arabic, right? Yeah. All these sorts of things that come from a lack of representation, this kind of thirst of the desert, right? Yeah. And we're starting to quench that to a degree, so that my kids, when I talk to them about representation, and I talk about how cool it is that character X is of Y race, or they're just sort of, well, yeah, of course. It's not as big a deal to them, but the fact that it's not a big deal is the big deal.
Totally,
and represents some progress that I think we've made. We still all the time see stupid images on TV. My kids are getting old enough that they're able to pick up on these things too now, and so we're watching they mostly watch YouTube videos now more than TV shows, and but whatever it is we might be watching or listening to or reading together, that stuff is still out there. And part of that is because no matter how well-intentioned the depictions are, they're always going to reflect political reality. And the reality is, we still live in a white supremacist country. We still live in a country that is patriarchal. We still live in a country where working people are treated like things rather than people. And our stories are going to reflect that. Yeah. Some of us are working very hard to make the stories reflect a different reality and maybe try and shape us toward another reality, but that will always be an uphill battle, and so that brings up the kind of second part of the equation, which is what's happening behind the scenes, and it's often pretty ugly. It's often most of these fields are still incredibly male dominated. Whether it's video games, whether it's TV, whether it's comics. I've been in those writing rooms, I've been in those meetings with executives and really seen what the real powers in these worlds look like. And they look pretty much like they've always looked. A few more women, but not many. And here and there a face of color, but not many. And it's really, and it's not even a wide sampling of white men that you see. It's like a small cadre of people who had family connections to an industry, or it's astonishing how closed some of these ecosystems are. And so, we're working to break them open, but I always remind people that just because you start to see different kinds of faces on the screen, we always also have to be pushing for different kinds of faces behind the scenes on TV shows and comics, and the creators have to, because it's a question of political power and of resources, right? I've worked some crappy jobs, I've worked some good jobs, I know people who've worked some really hard jobs, and this writing comic books for a living, there are things that are hard about it, but it's a pretty nice gig, and pretty nice gigs should not only go to one kind of person.
Exactly.
So it's a struggle on both sides of the page, I guess.
Yeah. And so, well, now with Copper Bottle, you have, created your own distribution channel that is, it's a subscription-based service, although right now you're offering the comics for free, where you are focusing on getting that representation off the page and getting this place for comic creators to get their work out there.
Copper Bottle is my pop-up imprint, as we're calling it, dedicated to my creator-owned comics, and it was born of a alliance with a Substack, which is a newsletter company that pretty recently reached out to a number of I hate to describe myself as leading, but a number of prominent comic book writers and artists, and offered them essentially grants to develop creator-owned work that we would maintain the ownership of. And so I've chosen to do that via this imprint. And now I'm publishing a couple of titles, one called Star Signs and one that's called Terror War. Terror War drawn by a local artist, Dave Acosta, Detroit's own. And we are producing work that we own is the simplest version of it. It's most people don't realize this, but the people who create characters and worlds and storylines that end up as billion-dollar films very rarely see any of that money, very rarely see any of that prestige, and they are essentially milked and left to dry. And so it's not a sustainable model. So we're trying to move toward comics where if you've drawn that comic, if you've written that comic, you'll have ownership of whatever that comic becomes. So if it's developed for TV, you'll see a fair slice of that. If it becomes a New York Times bestseller, you'll see a fair slice of that, so that people feel invested in the work that they're creating. And to me, that's just, it's an extension of what I think we need to be doing as a culture generally, is honoring the working people who create value instead of the corporations who just kind of suck it up.
Absolutely. And yeah, you mentioned both of those two comics. Yeah, Star Sign is out now. I read issue 1. It was very cool. Definitely intrigued to see where it's going from here. You describe it in the introduction as a found family with superpowers story, which of course, conjures up images of other stories like X-Men, which again is generally used as like a civil rights allegory. Yeah, just tell me a little bit about Star Sign.
Yeah, Star Signs is an idea that I've had percolating for a couple of years now, and this finally kind of turned out to be the right environment to make it come into the world. And I'm working with an incredible artist named Megan Levins and a great colorist named Kelly Fitzpatrick, and incredible letterer named Sean Lee, just a whole team of really crack folks working on this. And it's a story about the astrological constellations, the signs of the zodiac, falling to Earth. One day, they disappear from the sky, and no one knows why. Some say it's an act of God, some say it's an environmental catastrophe, but soon after they sort of manifest in people, in a diverse group of people, of a dozen people on Earth, giving them incredible powers, the power to stop time, super strength, the ability to control fire, things like that, right? Superpowers, essentially, yeah. Right? But the idea is having these superpowers dropped into our world, in a cast of folks that represents our world. And it's definitely a hearkening back to stories like old school X-Men, to Heroes, to all those sorts of stories that are about a motley crew of people having to work together as they discover who they are, and stuff blows up around them. So, nice. Yeah, so it's a fun one to write, and it's very cool to write stuff that feels superhero-ish but isn't constrained by the DC universe or the Marvel universe or what have you, and is just sort of making something new.
And then with Terror War, there's definitely a lot going on in that plot summary. The sort of like dystopian future, kind of logical extrapolation of the economic disparities and resulting social justice issues that we live with now. There's what sounds like a climate change apocalypse, kind of all wrapped up in this sci-fi horror story about fears as like actual monsters. Yeah, tell me a bit about that one.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one. It's makes sense that your head spins a little, because it's a science. Terror War is again, as with all my stories, is a story about its time and place, and is also a story about our time and place. It's a story about a character named Mohammed Cho, who is a product of a place called Blue City, and Blue City is a sort of megalopolis of 100 million people, the last place left on Earth after everything's been sort of scorched up and messed up by climate change and war and other things. And we have this glowing city where, much like our own society, a few people are at the top with a lot of people are at the bottom with very little. And in this world, our main character, Muhammad, is a terror fighter. What that means is that he has the power to fight creatures that haunt the city, known as terrors. And terrors are, well, nobody quite knows what they are. That's going to be part of the mystery of the series. What are these things? Where do they come from? But they are creatures that take the form of your worst fear. And so in the first issue, there's a guy who grew up scared of a certain cartoon character that he would watch, right? And so this character is coming after him as Muhammad goes to save him, right? And in another, it's a kid who's like dealt with some war stuff, and there's a giant soldier and so these things, whatever they are, take the physical form of the victim's fear and are seemingly invincible except for a small handful of people who have the ability to kill them. They become known as terror fighters. And much like our own society, the folks who get recruited to do the fighting are not necessarily chosen equally from among society, but they tend to reflect a lot of the prejudices and a lot of the unfairnesses that exist in society. And so, you know, it's a story about war, about service, about inequality, but it's also a sort of day-glow horror science fiction story, and the look of it is really wonderful. Dave Acosta, as I mentioned, a local Detroit artist, is just cooking up some astonishing things with this, so I'm really excited to share it with people.
And so when you write these stories, like, to what degree do you kind of write them with an art style in mind or with an artist in mind?
That depends quite a bit on the project. I recently completed another work with Dave Acosta called Dragon, which was a Ottoman era vampire story. It's a story about Dracula set in the Ottoman era. And I knew pretty strongly what the aesthetic to a degree of that book was. I knew Dave would be right to capture it. So I went to Dave, and he nailed it even better than I thought he would, and so that was great. There are other times where you have a vague aesthetic in mind, but you might not know. It's the working world. Artists are busy, or they're not into a project, or they're, and so you can't always know which artist will land with which project. Sometimes you do, but sometimes somebody gets sick, somebody gets hired by somebody else, things happen. And so it's a balance of sort of trying to write to an artist and trying to write something that people can bring their own mark to. I suppose that's the other part of it. It's not just the pragmatics of availability, but sometimes it can be dangerous for a writer to get too fixated on it's going to look like this, because that really starts to step on the artist's role, right? And comics is a collaborative process. The collaboration varies. With some artists, they are like, tell me exactly what to draw, tell me exactly how many panels on the page, tell me who's standing where, right? And that is they're engineers of something that you've drafted, right? There are other artists that have big architect DNA in them, and you just say, look, these two are fighting for these 2 pages. This guy blasts him at the end, and the artist says, okay. And they know exactly how they want to execute that. And really, you learn to negotiate that relationship. One of the things that's been exciting about working with Copper Bottle here and with launching my own initiatives has been that I can sort of tend to that relationship a little bit more and not be, when you're working in a corporate universe, it's really up to the controllers of that universe who's working with who. And so you might want to work with a certain artist and they say, no, we're hiring this guy for the book, or this woman for the book, or that guy for the book. Or and you say, well, but this person would be perfect. But you only have so much say. And so it's a remarkable amount of control, actually, to be able to pair with the artist you want, the way you want. And so increasingly in my creator-owned stuff, I'm then going to say, I know I'm working with Megan on this script, so I'm going to write to what I know Megan can do and not do, and stuff like that.
A few times, you've brought up the way that your writing kind of reflects social issues. So on Copper Bottle, in your discussion that you published with Spencer Ackerman about the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and its aftermath, you made a really interesting point that really stuck with me about how superhero media kind of reflects and interacts with sort of the ethics of what we as a society kind of like treat justice as, or what we sort of say is okay, and how that can be really ethically tricky in a genre where usually it's, these characters going, like taking the law into their own hands and essentially being vigilantes. And I'm just curious how you kind of grapple with like that sort of ethical conundrum that's so baked into the superhero genre when you're, writing for these superhero characters.
If you notice, anybody who's read a fair amount of my work will notice that the number of scenes where at the end the superhero swings off and the bad guy is in handcuffs with the police, there are very few of those in my comics. Very few. Even though typically that's how one ends a fight with a supervillain in the comics. And it's a very intentional choice. There's been a couple scenes where of necessity my characters have partnered with police, but in general, I try to bring a healthier skepticism of cops to my work than you see in superhero comics in general. I've tried to, and it's not just that, it's, to me, that's one iteration of the fact that, to me, justice is about your community, right? It's about, and so it's true that superheroes are vigilantes, but in some ways I have less problem with that than somebody who really has a strong faith in American law, because I have a deep mistrust of the American legal system. I've seen friends and family chewed up and spit out by it. And I don't necessarily think it's the best way to solve problems. And so, to me, one thing that superheroes can represent is community problem solving. I try to take time to show Ms. Marvel doing things like saving people from floods, right? I try to make, in the most recent Spine-Tingling Spider-Man, Peter Parker is helping an Uber guy deliver his stuff, right? Because to me, it's if you're just talking about like punching criminals or something like that, you got a really warped sense of what a good world looks like, right? What a just world looks like.
Yeah, and I mean, your work is very intentional about that. How do you feel about kind of how the superhero genre as a whole, the pop cultural juggernaut that it is right now, kind of does with grappling with those complexities?
I think there's a broad range, and I think that that's inevitable in an era where superhero stories are, our noir stories right now are superhero stories, our surrealist stories are superhero stories, our action stories, of course, are superhero stories, many of our romance stories are superhero stories. So, and by superhero, I don't just mean people in tights, but genre stuff. So science fiction, superheroes, fantasy stuff. That's amazing to me. When I was a kid, nobody knew who Iron Man was, right? People if people knew who Spider-Man was and the Hulk, but Batman, Superman, but that was about it. And now there are like TV shows that are about alternate versions of Marvel characters, and people know who these people are, and it's that's a trip to me. But I think that with superheroes expanding like that, it's meant that they've filled in a lot of other slots, right, in terms of the genres that we talk about. So I think that there are people telling powerful stories about superheroes out there, dealing with justice in a different way than we've always been told is right. And I think there are also lots of people telling the same old stories with the same old kinds of villains, and that's pretty boring.
Yeah. Well, and now, between Miles being in Into the Spider-Verse, and Kamala Khan getting her own Disney Plus series and joining Captain Marvel 2. So now it's two of the characters you've spent the longest time writing who have made that jump from the page to the screen. I mean, I'm curious how you feel about sort of like the differences in like what you do in comics versus like what is being done with the MCU stuff, and just kind of like how those very different mediums are tackling it.
For me, the way that I've kind of kept sane is just to not pay attention and to silo myself. When I went to see the Miles movie, I intentionally was like, I don't want to know anything about it beforehand, right? I don't want to know. It was, and they were putting that out right around the time I was launching my first issue, right? Oh, wow. And but I didn't want any advanced glimpses. I went and took my kids. Yeah. Went like a civilian. We had a good time. And I was surprised by things that happened instead of like already knowing things. Yeah. And there's separate worlds corporately, right? In most of these worlds, in both DC and Marvel, with Star Wars, with all these things, the publishing end and the comics end tends to be fairly separate from the film and TV end in terms of like they're literally in different offices in different cities often. And I think that's all to the good, actually. I think I'd feel constrained a bit if I thought too much about the film and TV stuff. But I will say, when I do things like, create a girl from Detroit superhero, right? Or create an Arab kid from Brooklyn superhero, I definitely am thinking about the fact that these characters are likely to get lives outside of comic books because a relatively small number of people actually read comic books. But a huge number of people will encounter these characters in other iterations. So I definitely think hard about that when I go to create something at Marvel about like, will this be in a TV show and who might that make happy,
Yeah, so. Yeah. We might be seeing a, superhero from Detroit in the MCU one of these days. Yeah. Building off of that, kind of with the state of geek culture right now, there's obviously a lot of kind of positives and negatives. On the one hand, we do see like all this like really toxic stuff that geek culture is grappling with in terms of, misogyny and racism and gatekeeping and that whole thing. But then, like you've said, it's also like more than ever, it's become like a normal thing that there's all these diverse characters and more diverse creators. I mean, I guess just how do you feel about just kind of like the state of like comic book culture or geek culture right now?
I mean, I'm on the one hand, again, I'm old enough that I can remember this stuff being just totally obscure and sort of just the pure excitement when anything came out, like the way our minds were blown when the first Batman movie came out in 1989, right? It was, you can't recapture that because now every week there are TV shows, movies that I miss, that I don't watch, that are based on things that if you had told me 20 years ago, there's a movie of XYZ, I've run out, and now it's like, but there's a movie of this, and a TV show of this, and a movie of this, and a TV show of this, and I got kids that I got to make dinner for, and and so it's a feast. It is, it's as a fan, it's a feast. I could not, it's a golden age. As a creator, it's incredible to be able to find work. I know a lot of people who are out of work right now, I will always be, that pragmatic, like, East Dearborn kid who's like, I've got a job and I'm thankful for it, But at the same time, it's a little scary when there are so many voices out there and so many things being thrown at people. How do you make your stuff stick? How do you make your story the one of them that people listen to? How do you make sure people even hear your story when there's so much out there? And that's really the challenge in a world where there's so much fantasy and science fiction and comics and all this nerdy stuff out there that we didn't have when I was a kid. Is how do you make sure yours connects with the people who want it, and maybe this is a bit dramatic but need it, and so that to me is the big job as much as creating.
You can find more at onedetroitpbs.org or subscribe to our social media channels and sign up for our One Detroit newsletter.